every bone in their 7-foot-long neck is snapping. When actually, the giraffe's skeletal structure is designed to handle the devastating blows. Just like a human's neck, a giraffe has 7 vertebrae. But whereas human vertebrae measure 1.5 inches in length, each giraffe bone is 12 inches in length and very thick. So while their necks are not really at risk in these battles, their internal organs are, because they use ossicones on top of their heads as battering rams. And what they're aiming for is not the neck. It's the soft underbelly. One perfectly placed blow by an ossicone to an internal organ can have deadly consequences.
We thought we were just going to knock people down. It's going to be left there, very badly damaged, and perhaps some hyenas or some lions might come along and do some scavenging.
The Aucklands were bracing for a bloody end, but they were relieved when one of the exhausted giraffes, the slightly smaller one, finally backs down.
Because giraffes are so peaceful, if one backs out, the battle is over. The giraffes can go back to eating. They may even feed from the same tree immediately afterwards in the same space.
Surprisingly, what felt like an hour had only lasted 4 minutes.
They just turned round and all of a sudden just seemed like on their feet and just walked away.
It's quite a peaceful ending.
Yeah, we're very lucky.
Untamed and uncut. Only on Animal Planet.
Okay, so what can we conclude from that visual experiment?
That they use their necks for...
Each other out. Right? So, can you guys see any problems with this experiment? What are the problems with this experiment? Yeah.
You can't really test it. You can just observe things that are happening.
Okay. So certainly that little report wasn't a scientific approach to this. Yeah. I like it. Others? I have a question for you. When were these data collected? Who knows, right? Who knows what kind of forage was available when those data were collected? It could be that at that point, lower shrubs is all that was available. And so, of course, giraffes are bending down to eat lower shrubs. What if some major drought happens, right? And all of the lower shrubs just get eaten by giraffes, gazelle, antelope, all those other things. And the only thing that's left are upper canopy acacia. At that point, who's going to be better adapted? And how often do those droughts occur? Relatively frequently. So we know very little about how those data were collected. And while in this example, giraffes' neck size doesn't seem to be necessarily all that important, there could be other important conditions in which neck length for feeding is really important, right? Okay, so let's talk for just a few minutes about the relative importance or strength of hypotheses and theories. And the placement of this slide is important because we're going to start talking about some biological theories. And I need you to understand the significance of that term theory. When I tell people that I'm an evolutionary biologist, commonly what I get is, yeah, but evolution's just a theory, right? And the response is, yeah, it's just a theory, but saying that something is a theory provides a considerable amount of strength to it. A theory is a hypothesis that's been tested multiple times and not been proven false. Is there the potential that evolution does not occur? Absolutely. Do we have any evidence to suggest, or do we have strong evidence to suggest that it does not occur? No, we don't. So saying something is a theory is a pretty important thing. In fact, most of us, well, I won't say that. Okay, so a hypothesis is something very different. A hypothesis is just an educated guess, a potential explanation for something. And I think when people say that's just a theory, that's really what they mean, right? That it's just a possible explanation or a guess about why things are the way that they are. Science has some inherent limitations. Probably the most important limitation is it's called the principle of empiricism. We have to be able to collect empirical data. We have to be able to collect data within science. If something is inherently not testable, then it's not within the bounds of science. Can y'all think of things that, given that definition, this requirement for empirical data, can you think of things that are outside the bounds of science? I'll give you one, and I think it's the one that all of us are thinking about that nobody wants to say, and that's faith. Faith rests well outside the bounds of science. Scientists can't collect data about evolution and say, evolution occurs, so there is no God. That's just not a possible thing for us to say. There are lots of people whose faith it is that there is no God because they are evolutionary biologists. Even that is a little bit tenuous, though. Conversely, what we cannot say is, I have faith, and what I believe is that there is no evolution. Because science and faith are completely disparate entities. Faith is inherently non-empirical, right? I mean, that's the purpose of faith. Faith is our ability to express some belief in something without actually seeing it. Science is exactly the opposite. I don't have to express faith in it. I observe it, I test it, and then I have an explanation. So science and faith, very disparate entities. Does that make sense? I think that that's an important distinction for us to make. Okay, so faith in the supernatural, and by supernatural we mean like paranormal, like ghosts, Bigfoot, Nessie, things like that. That's pseudoscience. That's well outside the bounds of traditional science. Though if you do go to, there are national meetings for like entomologists. That's what I go to for bug guys. There are national meetings for mammalogists, people that study mammals. There's always, in the national mammalogy meeting, there's always a section for Bigfoot and Bigfoot research. Okay, so there are 4 theories that are unifying theories within biology. This is where we'll conclude going over these 4. The first of which is cell theory. So I won't ask you on an exam about the individuals, like dates and who contributed to these theories. I would like you to know, however, what the theories state. So cells were originally observed by a fellow named Robert Hooke back in 1665. This guy was pretty cool. He made a microscope in his basement, basically, and he took a really thin section of cork and observed cork under the microscope. And what he saw was a lattice work, something that looked like this. It's like a whole bunch of building blocks like this. And then this guy named von Leeuwenhoek took Hooke's work and started looking at protists. So we got some pond water, and he saw little tiny things swimming around in the pond. And then these 2 guys, Schleiden and Schwann, in 1839, took Hooke's and von Leeuwenhoek's work and some other people's work, made some observations of their own, and recognized that all living organisms consist of at least one cell. So cell theory states that the cell is the fundamental unit of life. All organisms consist of cells. And importantly, all cells come from other cells. life comes from life. Now, you guys ought to start thinking about the paradox that I just introduced. Because what we assume as biologists, or what we have shown, is that a completely random event can lead to life. We can take a bunch of chemicals, electrify them, and make living type things from it, right? But that's contradictory to cell theory. What cell theory states is all cells come from other cells. Another unifying theory is gene theory. We're going to talk a lot about Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin, who's rarely spoken of when we talk about DNA. But Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin were the ones that described what DNA actually looks like. At the time, you see, we were debating about whether or not DNA or proteins convey information about an organism, their offspring. And we arrived at DNA, but nobody knew what the heck DNA looked like. And these three described the shape of the DNA molecule. What they said was, it consists of a backbone, two backbones, actually, that are alternating sugar and phosphate. And then there are these things called nucleosides that stick in the middle that make it look like a ladder. And if you were to take that ladder and you were to twist it, it would create a shape called a double helix. And that was Watson and Crick's contribution. I actually met Francis Crick. I was interviewing at different graduate schools, and he was one of those PhD programs I got admitted to was at UC San Diego. He was working there, and he's a really grumpy old guy. What gene theory states is that all organisms encode hereditary information with nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are either DNA or RNA. Now, the vast majority of the biological world encodes information as DNA. There are some viruses that encode their genetic information with RNA, but most everybody else uses DNA. And that we create proteins and other macromolecules from our DNA. And those proteins and other macromolecules make us look the way that we do, and to some extent behave the way that we do. Now, the sum total of all of our DNA is referred to as our genome. An individual has a genome. Populations have a gene pool. We ought not conflate those two. The next theory, and I love, in a very manly sort of way, I love Gregor Mendel. He is one of my absolute heroes in biology. So Gregor Mendel described genetics and how it is that information is actually passed between parent and offspring. You see, when Darwin was doing all of his work, he was somewhat contemporary with Gregor Mendel, but they didn't know about each other's work. What Darwin said was that what's being passed from parent to offspring is actually bits of the organ, right? So I have hazel eyes, and so I'd be passing bits of my hazel eyes to my offspring. But what Gregor Mendel said was, no, actually what we're doing is we're passing information about ourselves. Not the actual organ, we're passing information about ourselves. And he did all this work looking at garden peas. So he's this cool monk that lived in Austria that spent all of his time with garden peas. And from his observations with garden peas, he was able to correctly describe how it is information is passed not just in plants but in animals as well. So what it states is that information is passed from parent to offspring, and that information is a molecule called DNA, and DNA is organized into chromosomes. And through the regular processes of duplication of that molecule and separation of that molecule through mitosis and meiosis, we get our current patterns of inheritance. There's a reason, you guys, that you don't look identical to your siblings, and we'll talk about that reason a little bit later. And then finally, the final unifying theory is the theory of evolution. One of the things that Darwin contributed to the study of biology is a mechanism whereby we can explain both the unity of life That's the grand contribution of natural selection. It describes how all life could have started with a very reduced subset of organisms, or an organism, and arrive at the current diversity that we see. So Darwin did most of his work back in 1859. He collected a whole bunch of observations when he was out on a voyage on a ship called the HMS Beagle. We'll talk a lot more about Darwin later in the semester. But on this voyage, he observed a whole bunch of different living organisms, extant organisms, and a whole bunch of extinct organisms. And he recognized that there was some similarity between all these different organisms that he was looking at. And he provided this theory of evolution by natural selection. And really what it states is that evolution, if populations, genetic frequencies within populations are going to change over time. And natural selection says they're going to change in response to environmental conditions or selective pressures. Okay. So that is all of chapter 1. Are there questions that you guys have about any of the content that we went over today? All right, then when we get back together on Monday, we're going to start chapter 2, which has to do with biological chemistry. Okay? Have a great weekend, and I will talk to you next week.